Well, 2 weeks ago, the Rob Ford story almost seemed funny. Last week, it just seemed sad. How do you describe it now? Andrew's here in Toronto, Chantal's in Calgary, and Bruce is on assignment in Austin, Texas, which, interestingly enough, is where Rob Ford was about a month ago. Are they talking about this there?
Well, I don't know if I could say, Peter, that they're talking about it here, although on my way into the studio, actually, when I left Ottawa the first thing this morning, I watched Morning Joe, a popular MSNBC show. It was the first item that they discussed, and when I was on my way into the studio here, I saw a news broadcast that finished with the Rob Ford story, and it was clear that it was really a punchline to the news broadcast. People were laughing at Toronto, or at least Toronto's mayor.
How do we describe where we're at on this thing now? Is there a word to describe this? As I said, we were saying funny, then sad. What is it this week, Andrew?
Despair, impasse. It's a problem on a couple of levels. Obviously, there's the sort of constitutional, if I can put that way, problem of how do you get rid of a mayor who has clearly outworn his welcome and has disgraced himself in the office. But I think there's also a very dark undercurrent to the whole story that doesn't certainly get played in those U.S. reports where it's all about the mayor's personal problems. The problem resides with the city of Toronto. And the problem is not only you've got a mayor who's unfit for the office, but the company that he's keeping, the kind of criminal element that surrounds him, both from his friends in Etobicoke and these drug gangs, is, I think, the more that we learn about this, the more disturbing it becomes of the possibilities of were they blackmailing him, were they using him, what was he doing to try to cover up his activities. That, to me, is a very, very serious issue, and as funny as his brazenness and his willingness to sort of tell any lie to get out of it may be, that remains a very serious problem for the city.
Chantal?
I don't think it's a Rob Ford story anymore. I think it's a governance crisis of the biggest city in the country, and that is what we watched this week. Any pretense that things could go back to normal for a year, I think, died over the past 2 days as we all watched, and the entire country got to watch how this city council can no longer work. I mean, if Rob Ford was the leader of a political party on Parliament Hill, his caucus could probably get rid of him. But the city council in Toronto is incapable of resuming the normal governance of the city, and I think that is pretty obvious.
Well, I'll get to in a minute to what Premier Wynne said today and whether that changes the dynamic at all. But first of all, 2 weeks ago and last week we were talking about due process. We seem to have gone past that now. Due process doesn't seem to be a discussion point anymore, Bruce, but what does seem to be the discussion point is this sense that nothing can happen, nothing can change.
Yeah, I think it's a real wake-up call. I agree with Chantal. This is a governance question. I think it's something that most people probably never thought that we'd be confronted with. And the realization that the options available to remove somebody who's taken an oath to uphold an office that they were elected to by the public, that there's really no functional way to do that without doing something that seems quite anti-democratic. I think it is a wake-up call. I think it's something that probably needs to be addressed. There's probably got to be a short-term solution to the Rob Ford problem, but a longer-term solution that works more in the public's interest if we need to, at times, overturn a decision that has been made democratically in the past.
Well, the Ontario Premier suggests here that if the council comes to the Ontario government and says, look, we're deadlocked, there's nothing we can do here, that she would then look for the tools to do something if everybody in the Ontario legislature agreed, that there was a sense of unanimity on their part. Is that a way out, Andrew?
Yes, I think she's properly reticent to begin with. You don't want, obviously, the governor of Ontario coming in every time there's an unpopular mayor. You don't want, people settling vendettas. And she's also got an issue of if she came in and got rid of Rob Ford, what do you do with Joe Fontana in London and these kinds of situations? At the same time, I think she's also playing a little bit of a political game here, which is to put Tim Hudak of the Conservatives very much on the spot, because he obviously wants still to get that Ford Nation vote. And she can put him in the spot where he either has to stick with that vote or has to stick with her, and either way it doesn't look very good for him. I would be more persuaded of her sort of bipartisan approach to this if she'd come out with the leaders at the beginning of this process and said, we've all agreed we're going to work together on this and come up with a solution that transcends politics. I'm not as confident at this point that that's going to be the result.
Yes, but the advantage of what she's doing, I agree with Andrew on the politics of it, but it also possibly forces the Ontario Conservatives, Tim Udak, to try to put pressure on the Ford brothers. Maybe he'll be luckier than City Council, who knows. But that would be a first step before the province has to step in. I also think that what she said today was that Queen's Park is willing to start charting a course out of this impasse that comes through the legislature and not through City Hall. Now, the Quebec government grappled with the same problem for different reasons, in particular with the city of Laval, which is no small city. It would be Mississauga. And in the end, they put the city under provincial supervision. They appointed someone to kind of act as and oversee city council. There are mechanisms that don't involve just ousting the mayor, but that make it so that the mayor has little authority.
The other thing that Premier Wynne, one assumes, has to be careful of, and it was a Liberal who suggested this to me today, a provincial Liberal, said she's got to be careful. She can't forget she's not an elected Premier, right? She was elected by her caucus. She's sitting there as an unelected Premier in a minority government. So you got to be careful about what moves she makes to get somebody out of an elected office. But Bruce, on the Premier's weighing into this today?
Well, I think she is being prudent, and for a lot of really good reasons. I don't think there's any other way for her to proceed on this, but to try to fashion some sort of consensus, at least, that looks as though if a move needs to be made, that it's reasonable to look at it and say it's as democratic as can be fashioned without another election happening. But I think the other thing that's being lost a little bit here in the discussion about the mechanisms, not the discussion tonight, but the discussion this week about mechanisms, is really at some point this is a question of honor and dignity. And I, for one, would welcome seeing more politicians talk about this and the fact that that they, when they take oaths, have a responsibility to act in a certain way, to conduct themselves with a certain amount of honor and dignity. And that needs to be taken into account when they're considering what their options are, not just looking to fight for every clause, every rule, every advice from a councillor.
The difficulty is, and we've seen that degraded in a lot of different situations, never quite to this extent. I mean, I don't think it was ever anticipated you'd ever have somebody who was this dysfunctional and this unwilling to admit it, or to in the final thing be able to say, I can't go on anymore, the council won't work with me, etc. So it is, in some ways, a unique situation. What Wynne was talking about today was that the council could ask her for, quote unquote, the tools to deal with this situation. And one of those tools might be, and this is not original to me, but I think it's a suggestion worth taking up, is what Ford can plausibly argue is, look, I was elected to do a job, and only the people should really be able to remove me if I haven't broken any laws, et cetera. And at this point, there's no proof that he has. Maybe what the answer to that is to put this to a vote of the people without waiting a year for the election to stumble along, but to put it to a plebiscite or a referendum. And you probably would need some change in the city legislation to make that possible. But that might really call his bluff, if you will. If he's got the support of the people, then we'll have to put up with it. But if he doesn't, then it's a way to remove him without spending the next year waiting for this.
Yeah, it might take a year to get to a plebiscite.
Well, yeah, if you're going to start playing with plebiscites a year from a municipal election, less than a year, you're better off starting to play with the notion that you're going to advance the municipal election. I mean, it's possible to delay municipal elections in some circumstances. I'm sure the Ontario government doesn't have less tools than the Quebec government. In Lac-Mégantic, for instance, there was not a municipal election when everybody else voted 2 weeks ago because of the emergency. They kept the council in place for an extra year. The reverse is also possible. It would make more sense than to force people to have to go through a campaign to decide if they want to get rid of the mayor, and then have a campaign to find a new mayor.
I've only got a couple of minutes left. I want to change the subject. I should just correct myself. I think I kind of suggested that Wynne got the job when her caucus voted for it. It was really her party voted for her, not the caucus. But switch the subject for a couple of minutes. Senate referral. It's funny, the Supreme Court of Canada is trying to determine whether or not, or what the ground rules should be for either abolition or reform of the Senate. Normally, on a week like this, we'd all be up there. It'd be the big story. We'd all be talking about it. It's been squeezed out by a number of things this week, and not the least of which was the Rob Ford story. What should we know about what happened in that courtroom this week? Bruce?
Well, I think we should know that a number of provinces have weighed in and basically said on the question that the federal government has asked, which is can they make changes to the Senate without the unanimous consent or without a very broad consensus among the provinces. A lot of provinces have been weighing in saying, no, actually you can't, that this is a change that fundamentally affects their interests and that they would go along with it. Now, the court will take a good while to hear more arguments and to ponder the choice, but I think we're already getting a sense that making a change in the Senate, a fundamental change, is going to be a very difficult thing to do. Now, we probably already knew that. The federal government probably already knew that, and I think at the end of the day, it's going to be up to the federal government to fashion some form of political leadership if it really wants to accomplish a change that's fundamental.
All right, Andrew, briefly.
A couple of just caveats on that. I mean, the Senate, the Supreme Court gave the government lawyers a really rough ride, and people are reading into that therefore the case is cooked. Oftentimes they do that with lawyers just to sort of test their arguments, and you can't necessarily read into that. And similarly, even with the provinces that were opposing the right of the government to go 750, that doesn't necessarily tell us where they'll come down on the issue of reform or abolition itself. They may simply want to make the point on the proper procedures.
All right, you get the last word, Chantal. What's your takeaway from it?
That we are not going to see abolition anytime soon, and that the federal government's rough ride means something. Today, the federal lawyer argued that the Supreme Court should just allow the federal government to do whatever it wants to do to avoid 135 years of talk. Well, that's like asking the Supreme Court to throw out the rules of federalism. And I think this week the federal case came across as rather weak.
All right.
Populist, but weak.
Okay, we should warn viewers that it's going to be months before we hear the result of what was argued this week as the judges, the justices now make their decision. But it'll be well into next year before we hear that. Bruce, enjoy Texas. Chantal's in Montreal, and Andrew here in Toronto. Calgary, you're in Calgary, Chantal.
Yes.
It just looks like Montreal in the background there. Sorry about that.